welcome to another Northern Monkeys video. In this one we're going to be talking about how to learn the rules of a new faction, beyond just reading the data sheets and the general kind of, detachment abilities, army abilities and how that works. 40k is such an in-depth and complicated hobby that you tend to just you don't be able to get a grasp of what the army is just from reading the rules. So we're going to look at different sources you can go to learn the rules, different ways to look at it. And yeah, let's get into it. So you've made that decision to I'm wanting to switch up my faction, my sub-faction, whatever it is. Like in this particular case, I wanted to learn more about Fellhammer, have a bit of a different vibe for my Chaos Space Marine force. So where do you go with that? I mean, it's a tricky one, right? 'Cause you can just read the codex, read the detachment rule, but that only gives you so much insight. And with the game being so complicated, you definitely want guidance. And especially if you don't have a bunch of friends who you can, talk about this and play with, who are really into all the rules, it can be tricky. So there are Discord groups that exist. They definitely, for almost all factions, there'll be a Discord group out there. But they can be a little tricky to find. Usually you kind of have to go down the rabbit holes from subreddits or whatever. But speaking of those, we've got Reddit pages. They're a little hit or miss. Some are way larger and way more focused. And they tend to be really, really good for sort of seeing things on a day-to-day basis of what the faction, where things are evolving. But some of them are way less rules focused, and you'll go on the subreddit and it's more just pictures of people's armies, which are very cool to see, obviously, and you can get involved in that side of the community. But it's not necessarily the best place to learn your rules. Now, a great place as well, just for this kind of independent learning, stuff to put on the background, is YouTube. There's loads and loads of good stuff on there. There's so many channels doing good things. You've got Tabletop Titans, Tabletop Tactics, Play on Tabletop, Tabletop something or other. I'm sure there's something like that for everyone. Maybe you like their style, maybe you don't. There's loads of short form stuff, long form stuff. But it can be a little hit or miss depending on the faction you want to see. So for the example here, I was focusing in on those Iron Warriors, Fellhammer, Siege Host kind of vibes. And it was really, really difficult because in one ways it was really good because Tabletop Tactics have that kind of army and they enjoy it, but they're a lot less focused on the comp side most of the time. They're very sort of fun, casual games, which is a good way to see how the army plays, but not necessarily the best way to sort of learn the rules. Now, there was also, very luckily, in my case, there was a channel called Warhammer. He did some great Iron Warriors style battle reports with loads of different stuff, so you really got to see the army fleshed out there. But not everyone's going to be so lucky. And don't forget, the problem with this is if you're watching something from a year ago, 2 years ago, it might not really be relevant to what you're looking at. So why do all this though? Why go to the point of researching your army, learning all this stuff? I think personally, I have a lot more fun playing when I know what I'm doing. I've gone into a few games where I've been oh yeah, I'll just try out this detachment, and you kind of end up just not playing a detachment because you don't really remember the rules, or you just, if you're playing Space Marines, you're just I'll just use a command point, reroll an Armor of Contempt every turn, and not think about it any more than that. Which I think sort of robs yourself of the experience. The gameplay in 40k is very, very weird and casual in a lot of ways, but it's also there is depth to it and nuance, and factions do feel very, very different to each other. I certainly felt that when I've played different sub-factions. It's been cool. Sometimes you really miss your old sub-faction as well if you change just for the sake of it. But also, it's common courtesy to your opponent. You don't want to be you rock up to a game with someone in a casual setting and you're you just waste hours of their time by constantly flicking through your rules and stuff. It's just not on. So yeah, there's plenty of reasons to do all this research, and it's also a fun part of the game, right? Goon Hammer, that's one of the first places I usually go to try and learn up a bit more in depth on a faction. They do these great and fairly, regular. Most releases you'll get a Goon Hammer release alongside them, and this is their sort of overview for the Fellhammer Siege Host. Now, I think this is a good microcosm of Goon Hammer. They've got way more stuff. They go into all the stratagems, and they usually give them gradings and things like that, and they update them if there's a big change in one of the data slates or something like that. But I think it's a really great page to learn the basics and get those kind of insights into what you might look at, what units are good for an army sometimes, where you want to go. and it's very easy to read. You know, they have commentary from different people, which I think is good, because it's easy. You do really need to get different perspectives with stuff like Warhammer, because players have their own biases against factions and units, and it's their own experiences. So it's good to get that, like, multiple different sources. And I think this sort of shows here one of the problems with Goon Hammer is that they can get a bit out of date. Like, they have this take on the detachment rule, Iron Fortitude, where Iron Fortitude I think is really, really good. Just that -1 to wound in shooting against stuff that's got a higher strength than you do toughness. And Goon Hammer kind of discounts that, because they're like, oh, well, it doesn't work in melee, and, oh, you know, it's like, is it really going to be that impactful? But I think that's one of the things. This is they have very broad takes on a lot of things, you know, like, I don't think anyone there is a specialist, like, player. And when they do this review, it's generally like when the codex has just come out. So even though it's very well put together and very well informed, it is very much like a hot take, and it has not too much like context in terms of like gameplay behind it. So I think that's one of the downsides to Goon Hammer, but I'm not knocking them at all. They're an absolutely fantastic place to go and learn everything you want to. So I chose Fellhammer as my army, so specifically to try and get back into Chaos Space Marines. I play them quite a lot this edition and last edition, using the Renagade Raiders detachment. My army is Astral Claws themed, so that kind of Astral Claws, Red Corsairs, it made natural sense for me to go the Red Corsairs themed detachment. And it had a lot of sort of the similar theming to 9th edition, which was when I built this army. So generally it was a good choice. It was a really good choice. But I found it to be, like, Renegade Raiders is definitely considered, like, I think, probably the best Chaos Space Marine detachment. I know there are other good ones, like the Black Legion themed one, and I really like the Word Bearers themed one. They're both sort of strong and considered, you know, good and playable in the meta. Personally, I know that most people really don't like playing against that Word Bearers themed one. Between the lone op stratagem that can just make your vehicles basically immune to shooting, and the crits on 5s doing lethals and sustained and stuff, it's not a fun experience, I think, for some people. So yeah, that was in the index, which was sort of like, I think, kind of Chaos Space Marine Zenith. And then the codex came out. Everyone really likes Renegade Raiders. I played Renegade Raiders because it was sort of the one my army was themed towards, and it was really strong. Like, don't get me wrong, it felt great. But I just didn't. I don't know, something about Chaos Space Marines compared to all my other armies. You know, I play like 2 or 3 others, and they just felt very frustrating compared to everyone else. It felt like quite an elite army, and it also felt like they could really whiff on their damage activations and then be punished really badly for that, because they felt quite very elite, almost way more elite than my Marines. I think that was just the models that I happened to have for this army. But yeah, I really kind of increasingly found this army frustrating, and the way Renegade Raiders play is very gunline, which I don't love. Even though they do have stratagems for like enhancing your melee, I just felt like it was always quite lacking. And maybe it was just rolls, you know, the sample size was probably only a dozen games. So, but who knows? But I've decided to come back into Chaos Space Marines because I love the way that they play. I love that you get to play Space Marines without having to just constantly play mirror matches, in a way. And I do like the general sort of, you know, I love this army. I want to play it. I put a lot of work into it, and so obviously I want to see that on the board. So I judged it up, did all the redid the bases, made sure everything was all touched up nicely, and got them back on the board with Fellhammer, because it was a bit different. And to be honest with you, the -1 to wound in shooting really appealed to me, because I don't like being just leaf blowed off the board. It's definitely one of the worst experiences you can have on the game board, just because of how uninteractive it feels. So as I was trying to learn, I looked more into it, kind of, and luckily I think I was browsing through the Warhammer competitive subreddit, which is a great place to go for just general kind of looking at the game. I'd always recommend it. You know, it's not very it's well moderated, and it's not like you just see loads of rubbish on there. It's generally just good stuff, and you get things like the Meta Monday, which is always an interesting read, even though, you know, it's not really that relevant to most people who play the game, but it's cool to see stuff like that. And yeah, I found through that Warhammer, which it seems to do a lot of different things based around the chaos side of 40k. You know, there's demons and all sorts of content on there, but also found they were doing a sort of a stint where they were looking at Fellhammer And, perfect timing, really. This was more luck, but all their articles are really good, and they tend to stay, like, they do these blogs, and they're very up-to-date. It's clearly a guy who's going out there, going to the RTTs, and even the super majors, or whatever they're called, the big tournaments, and just really, really getting in there and, like, learning this force. And it's, generally the stuff that they're saying can apply to all of Chaos Space Marines, but I was just very lucky that they happened to have this, like, very dense, very well written articles and tournament reports and things like that. So it was really, really cool. And they're a hoot to read. There's lots of funny stuff, like you can see the tactics up there. That one really tickled me. And they just generally have a good sense of humour, and it's a good way to learn stuff, which I thought really, really helped me sort of develop my game plan going into this army, about, like, using the infantry units to take more advantage of the army rule, sort of considering different tactics and sides of the army, sort of, and the different enhancements that's considered quite good. Like, a cool one was stacking using the Chaos Space Marine Sorcerer and Terminator armor. He's pretty cool because he can use his ability to give +1 AP for your army against a unit, which is really, really helpful. Like, that's amazing for Chaos Space Marines. It's such a strong ability, and it goes off on a 2-up, so it's relatively reliable, although I'm waiting to get burned by that. And then you've also got the ability to strip cover off your opponent, so all of a sudden your shooting goes, like, I know it's a silly example, but on a Chaos Space Marine Predator tank with the auto cannon, you can literally, your AP goes from 1 to 2 to 3 to kind of 4 by stacking all the various abilities and removing cover and things like that, which I just kind of like. It's nice. It really is. And yeah, this Warhammer, I'd super recommend it, but obviously their content is a little filtered toward chaos more than anything else. So I've had a single game of Fellhammer. What are my thoughts and feelings on it afterwards, after doing all this research and kind of trying to learn it? How did it go? Well, I had a game at the Cave against a fellow monkey. It's a really good game, Ultramarines versus Astral Claws. We've played this many times before, Dance This Dance. And it was a good one. It was just a cracking game, went really backwards and forwards. None of the dice were particularly crazy, which was almost relieving when you're trying to sort of feel out an army. But yeah, it was a good one. The detachment rule, really, really great. I think there was some serious firepower on the Ultramarine side of things. There was a Vindicator, a Redemptor, a Ballistus. I want to say there was some other nasty shooting in there. I think there was at least a Hellblaster squad and some Eradicators, stuff like that. All things that generally, you don't want to be getting rinsed by, shooting-wise. But the detachment rule, it came in really good a few times. There was Legionaries were spared the wrath of the Redemptor by it in its shooting phase a couple of times, which, that was my own positioning mistake, but the army rule helped out there. And at least one of my Predator tanks was being peppered by the Ballistus all game, and I think out of the 4 shots that went through, there were like a bunch of 3s got rolled on the wound roll, which meant obviously these las cannons weren't wounding the Predator tank. So really, really good. So maybe I was just lucky. It's obviously a very small sample size, but I think that Predator tank would have been brown bread without the detachment rule. And then the Predator tank went on to really, really like clutch up in the late game and mow down Calgar and his squad. So yeah, maybe the army rule won me it there. Chaos Space Marines I've found are generally a really, really good army, but there's just something about them is quite hard to play. I can't really put my finger on why. They feel a little fragile, but I think the sort of the advice on Warhammer really, really worked here. Like, they don't struggle in melee. Like, you will win a lot of melee fights just on your raw like power of the sustained hits and the good weapons. Like, Legionaries are an insanely good squad. I don't even have mine sort of optimally kitted out with like the las cannon or the melter gun or whatever. I just have the double heavy melee weapons, and they're ferocious, and just they'll really, really win a flank and output way more than their points say that they should. I did find the kind of sort of some advice I think I saw from someone on YouTube was talking about how the stratagems in Fellhammer are quite hard to get the timing right on, and that was definitely true. Like, I had sort of plans about the -2 to charge one, but then that ended up not coming off. I was hoping to do the full rerolls to hit and wound when Calgar went into my Terminator squad in the centre. I was like, oh yeah, he'll knock a bunch of them down, but then I'll get the full hit and wound rerolls on the clapback and just smash Calgar. No, Calgar killed the whole squad. So that didn't really work out. But generally the detachment rule worked out really, really well, and there's just a bunch of good stuff, you know. It was all, the threat of it was all there in terms of those stratagems. So yeah, I enjoyed Fellhammer. I've got another game tomorrow, so we'll maybe see how that goes, and if I win, maybe I'll make a battle report. But I probably will not be taking enough pictures to do that. But we'll see. It's hard to learn a new army, but I think you owe it to yourself and your opponents to really go for it and just, you know, get your rules down. So thanks for watching. A bit of a different style of content here, but I feel like it's generally fairly applicable through all the editions of just how to learn an army. I think, you know, you owe it to yourself and your opponent to know your rules, because you just have a better experience for everyone. So it's good to do, and yeah, like and subscribe if you haven't already, and to everyone who has subscribed, thanks. It's good to know that the videos are doing well out there with people.